So I'm just going to keep going on this one too, because it is again a beautiful day and we shouldn't be in here. Okay, so hi everybody out there. Week 11, just 2 more to go, this one and next one. So I've returned all your proposals. That means everybody on line 2 and everybody here, you got them back, right? Good. There's a couple of people I've put in touch as you're looking at the same things. You, Diego, with Natalia, did you guys talk to each other yet?
I can.
Okay, you need to contact her because she doesn't have your email.
Oh, okay.
Because I couldn't find yours, but I could find hers. So Natalia, Diego will contact you today. Will you not?
Yes.
Yeah, because you have hers.
How did you email
me? Because I could get you through eCollege, but it won't show me your email address. Whereas Natalia's, I already had her email address. So I need you to contact her tonight because she's already contacted me and said, you haven't given me Diego's email. And I'm like, I know, because
I'll do that today.
Anywho, so you guys are both doing emotions and SLA. So go ahead and share your materials and any of your findings. That's great. And then Carla online and John online have both decided to do complexity theory. So you two go ahead too. And FYI, anybody out there who might be interested, Dr. Tado has decided he's super interested in complexity theory. So we will be starting a reading group on Diane Larson Freeman's book on complexity theory and language. So I will update you. That won't be till after this semester ends, but it will probably be about mid-May. So I'll update anybody, and anybody that wants to join can join. I assume data analysis 3 went okay. The 3 people here seem to have been okay. So I hope everybody's okay with it out there. I'll take a look at that. And this week we're doing Chapter 11. We flipped the chapters. So if we sort of contextualize where we've gone and where we're going, thus far we've looked at internal factors, right? We spent some time looking at special nativism, which was what? What was special nativism?
The universal grammar.
Good. The universal grammar, the idea of Chomsky's idea that we have an LAD, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Then this idea that maybe we don't need all that architecture in our brain, that we could be doing it using general cognition. And then last week we looked at information processing. So how general cognition and information processing go together. And then we've also looked at non-language factors, right, which are also called individual differences, and they include what?
Learning styles.
Learning styles.
The setting of your learning.
Yeah, we're coming back to that, but yeah. Learning styles, anxiety, motivation, all that. Anything that varies between people, so individuals. So we've now got 2 factors left. Sociocultural factors as opposed to psycholinguistic ones. So things outside the learner as opposed to inside the learner, and instructed SLA. So today you read sociocultural factors. For next week, you'll read instructed SLA, and then we are done. That's your basic seminar in SLA. And I'm hoping next year to be able to offer a second level seminar if there's enough interest in SLA, because I love this stuff. All right. So sociocultural factors are really broadly defined, sort of like individual differences. They basically cover anything to do with language use. So that typically includes anything to do with a language situation. So a task, what the task is, social status, relationship, anything that might vary because of gender. So in that, there's some crossover with individual differences, right? But generally speaking, think of it less as individual differences and more as something out there that's affecting your behavior in general. So sociocultural theory, we haven't really spent, well, we're not spending any time on. It's not something that I'm hugely into. I mean, basically, you can live your entire career just doing sociocultural theory. And it has really come to us through the work of Vygotsky, which some of you may know. Some of you out there may know because he's pretty big in education. So of any of my other three, no, he's not so big in linguistics. Well, he is now, but he wasn't. But he was pretty big in education, has been for a long time, a Russian. And he was the one that came up with something called zone of proximal development, which is a term that a lot of people know. So sociocultural theory was essentially the settling in of Vygotsky's work and the kinds of things that he was interested in into an applied linguistic environment. So it really took off in the 1990s and 2000s. And certain concepts come with sociocultural theory. You see 4 important ones right there that are in your book. Mediation, which is language as a tool. It connects our physical and our social environment. It connects us to our physical environment and to our social environment, obviously. Then these are the things that have to do with the reason that it's big in education. So regulation is the idea that when you learn something with your small child, you begin by other regulation. So what's called an expert, you're a novice, and what's called an expert is the person that helps you develop your language. So that's like your caretakers or whatever. And then you move slowly towards self-regulation as you move into your own ability. Not dissimilar is this idea of internalization, which is initially through imitation, but cognitive-based imitation, not behavioral-based imitation, right? So again, you're the novice and you look towards the expert, your caretakers, your parents or whatever, and then you practice. And one important way they say of practicing is private speech, which is basically the things that you do to yourself. You tell yourself. You either talk aloud or you think it through yourself, and it's an internal dialogue, monologue, I guess, with yourself. And then the last one is ZPD, which is zone of proximal development, which is essentially another. It's a not dissimilar idea. It is dissimilar in the sense that it's a much different thing, but it's the same sort of idea as I+1. Okay, that basically you know this much, and then there's somehow you've got to get from this much to this, you know, so you move. And the difference between this and this is the zone of proximal development. Right? So this is not dissimilar from the idea of input +1. So you move forward by, but the difference is that you get to the zone of proximal development and you get through it and you move through with the help of an expert. Again, this idea of caretaker, parent, and so on. So underlying all these concepts is the idea of social acquisition of language. Now, when we put it that way, can you see how different that is from, for example, special nativism? In what ways is it like fundamentally a different concept?
can't learn it on your own.
Good. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, you can't learn it on your own. Under sociocultural theory, language is considered to be a part of social development. All right. Now, obviously, special nativism, you can't learn it on your own, in that if you don't have any input, you can't. But then the idea is once you have the input, it's your structure that does that, right? What sociocultural theory says is a much more general cognitive and social model that, and if you really get into it, it really talks about the fact that they believe that this is how language started in the first place. You know, that it was socially conditioned, and something that it came out of it didn't come out of a special architectural development of the brain, it came out of a social need, right? So that we're talking about two fundamentally different ideas of why we have language and what moves it forward, right? So this has a lot of interest in first language acquisition, so how children learn. For example, is there something going wrong?
It doesn't start recording.
It's still recording?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I thought something was going wrong. I forget now what I was saying. Anyway, it's this idea that if you not only should you not isolate children or adults who are learning language, but that if you want an adult to learn a second language, you've got to recreate some of these circumstances and put them in a social environment in order for them to learn, right? So this covers everything from making sure that there's input, output, and interaction, all the way through to what we'll do at the end, which is study abroad, right? But all of them have this basis in social interaction. Is that okay? Boom. So one of the newest ideas, for example, of sensitivity to ZPD. So how do you move this zone of proximal development is gesture and the use of gesture within cognitive linguistics. So basically what it says is there's a difference between languages. There's a typological difference between languages, and typological differences just means that you get groups of languages that are typologically similar and some that are different. So you can put languages together. So for example, the Romance languages are typologically similar. They're all part of a typology. English and German are typologically similar. Then you get weird languages like Hungarian that are typologically out there, or Basque, or, you know, languages where we seem to have a missing link as to where they came from, and so on. So what they're saying is there's a typological difference between something called satellite framed languages and verb framed languages, which is kind of interesting actually. It's not anywhere near as complicated as it sounds. Essentially what they say is that the way we learn language is by chit-chatting with, you know, being together, and by general cognitive structures. So the same way in which I learn that I can touch something as a baby, that I learn, you know, to approximate distance, and I learn that I can pick up and hold and so on. So I also learn the structure of language. And this is the example they use. Satellite framed, and this is all based in cognitive linguistics and the idea of a initial place and a trajectory. satellite frame has a path of motion that's expressed in adverbs or particles, in this case, prepositions or adverbs, and a type of motion. The type of motion is expressed in the verb. So you have, for example, the cow jumped over the moon. So that's not the same example that's in your book, but I thought it was a better example, actually. The verb expresses the type of movement. In this case, jump as opposed to run or walk. But the trajectory, the actual path of the motion, in this case over, is expressed through the adverb or the preposition or whatever goes with the verb. Now, what they say, and here I'm you know, looking at Diego because I got nothing in either Spanish, and I'm looking at Shihan because I have nothing in Spanish or Korean. But what they're saying is that verb-framed languages such as Spanish and Korean have both the motion and the path inside the verb.
Out of that example,
That's a bad example.
with the cow jumped over the moon, in Spanish it translates word for word.
Oh, it does. Okay, so let's look at their examples to see if we can see if we can make a better example. We are on page. They have a Spanish and a Korean example. So we are 297. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay, so here's the Spanish example. The little bird leaves from the cage giving hops. The idea is that the verb, which is what, sale? Sale includes both the motion and the path. Does that make any more sense to you?
Yes.
Well, now I'm going to make Shihan's life miserable. There's a Korean example. Oh, you're looking at it? Okay. So the Korean example is, oh no, that's it, right there. That's the Korean example. So the Korean example is something is rolling down the hill. So presumably the idea of rolling and down is all in the verb, is what they mean. Is that true? Because the idea is you'd have to have the path of the motion. You've got both the motion, which in this case is rolling, and the path of the motion, which in this case is down, and both of them are inside the verb.
Yes, that's true.
Is that true?
Yes.
Sweet. Thank you very much. So the one that we can understand, we're struggling with Spanish. Did we do any better with the Spanish now?
Well,
It's not working for you, is it? I can tell.
I kind of see what they're saying because they're saying the little bird hops from inside to outside of the cage.
Ah.
But in the okay, so I guess they're comparing it to 11.2,
Yeah.
where they have to say it hops out of the cage.
Yes.
Where in Spanish you can only go outside. You're already inside.
Ah, so great. So that is exactly correct, Diego. So the action
So I just have a moment.
is that no, that's great. That's great. I mean, it's good that we now really understand it. So the action is the hopping, and what you're saying is the hopping and the out are in the verb.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that when they say sale, which means the bird leaves,
Yeah.
you can't leave something unless you're
Inside that. All right, perfect. And then this also, great. Okay, fabulous. So that's exactly what that means. And what they argue is then that this is becomes a cultural practice that's embedded in the language. So that your concept of how the world works is embedded in your brain, at least partially, due to how the language works. So in terms of cognitive linguistics, this would say that the action and the trajectory you either see as a single thing or you see as two things. And if, sorry.
So this is similar to how we did in the language analysis, where they thought that the pronoun was included in the verb. And so they would omit it when it wasn't actually necessary.
Yes, yeah, although that's a syntactic issue, but yes. The idea is that in this case, the reason that that's different is that in that case, it's literally a syntactic difference, right? In this case, the idea is that it's about general cognition of movement. So if you now say that there's no special nativism, that it is all general cognition, and that the way we're learning language is the way we learn everything else, then like about space and about motion and everything else, then you're saying that embedded culturally in the language is a way of viewing the world. Does that make sense?
So I have to learn how to view it in the other language.
Exactly, and that this can be a problem when you, that's exactly correct. And when you do second language acquisition, you not only have to learn the different syntax, but you have to understand that there's a different point of view on the world. Okay, so if I'm coming to Korean or to Spanish, I hopefully eventually work out that I don't need to have a marker for both the action and the trajectory, which I do in English. I can just have one marker and that means the whole gig. Yeah. And vice versa, right? That coming into English, you need to learn that those two things are separated out. If you're in a verb-framed language and you're going to a satellite-framed language, you have to work out that they're separated. Does that make some kind of sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So I find this kind of fascinating, and it's really new. Back when I was doing this, there was no such thing as a satellite-framed and a verb-framed language. So I mean, you know, obviously there was, but there was no one had labeled it, right? And the thing I find interesting is back when we started, we were looking at very obvious differences between languages. So for example, we would say there's the famous color terms wheel, right? Where, you know, some structuralist linguist would go, you know, trogging off into the jungle with a color wheel and say to whomever he managed to meet, you know, or she met, well, it's he for the most part, you know, what color do you call, you know, do you call this, and what color do you call this? And the idea was to see if between us, you know, we had the same, and, you know, essentially what they found is that we all use primary colors, but not a lot of the rest of the things we don't use, right? So that's a very straightforward way of looking at language differences. This is slightly more sophisticated, right? Because this has to do with how you're viewing things in the world and how they move around and how they should move around and how they would move around. So I really like this idea. Very much inside cognitive linguistics, very much not my area, but I'm going to do some more reading, I've decided, on this, because Lantoff it's come out of is very interesting. Any questions on this? Alrighty. Okay, the next area of sociocultural differences is something called variationism. And this variationist perspective has been around for you guys since the dawn of time, the 1980s. And essentially covers correlations of social facts and linguistic forms, right? So if we say that something like this has come from education and psychology, this comes straight out of L1 dialectology studies. Do you know, have you heard of a guy called Labov? Yeah, some of you. Okay. So he did a bunch of very famous studies in dialectology. He was the one that came up with the idea that you are closest to your real dialect, to your real language, when you are talking in your vernacular, meaning chit-chatting and not trying to be anything, right? So you're focused on, so it's who you are at your core, right? That's what we think of as a vernacular speech. So because of that, he said the way that you have to find out people's dialectal features is to ask them something that's so super interesting that they'll forget that they're talking to you, right? And he was the one that came up with, tell me about your most frightening experience. And the idea that was that, you know, by the time this person was chatting to you about their most frightening experience, they'd sort of forgotten that they were being recorded, or they'd forgotten the idea of the observer's paradox, right? That they're going to try harder because you're asking them, because the content is so much more interesting. So this came straight out of L1 dialectology. And the other thing he did that's super famous, and you can look it up if you're interested, with L1 was something he called social stratification of linguistics forms. So this is really social factors, meaning class particularly, dialect and so on, but everything related to class, and the linguistic forms that we speak and how that comes together. So one of his most famous studies was what he calls social stratification of art. So he went into, so this was in New York, where I don't do a really good accent. Does anyone do a really good New York accent? Let's say fourth floor. It sounds a bit Boston-y to me, but I don't know if anyone, fourth floor?
Fourth floor.
Fourth floor. Perfect. Okay. So what he said was, in New York, depending upon whether you wanted to have high prestige value or middle prestige value or low, your pronunciation of that R in fourth floor changes, okay? And so what he did, he went to 3 different department stores, like the poshest department stores, so like Bergdorf's, I guess, or Saks, Fifth Avenue, or I know we're all looking at each other like, oh, and a middle kind of store, which I guess would be, I don't know, Macy's, right, maybe, and then a low thing, which would, I guess, be Walmart or something. I don't know. You'd have to read to see where he actually went. You'd have to read the study. But then he would record people. He would go to the shop assistant, and he would say, he would know what was on the 4th floor. So he would say, let's say the shoes are on the 4th floor, right? He would say, where are the shoes? And she would say, go up to the 4th floor, right? And he would say, oh, I'm sorry, what? So she would have to do it again, even more emphatically, right? 4th floor, right? So that whatever her pronunciation was, it was really, and he found exactly this. He found that there was a systematic variation in the pronunciation of that liquid consonant, depending upon whether people thought they were being posh, medium, or not posh. So that's where variationism comes from.
I guess the R would be in the middle.
The R, yeah, 4th, yeah.
Because like the posh would be 4th floor, almost English.
Right.
In middle class, you'd have the most R. It'd be just almost like a standard American English, 4th floor.
Right.
And then the lower would be the heading you like fourth floor.
Yeah, right. That is exactly right. That's exactly what it came out as. And you can pull that study up on Google Scholar or anywhere. It's a fun study. And essentially from that tiny little study, he started a whole field in the 1960s and 70s called variationism, which meant how the linguistic form changes based specifically, well, he was most interested in social class, but he also did a lot of work with AAVE. He was the one that went out to Philadelphia, and he went down to the mean streets of Philadelphia and got a lot of working class AAVE speakers, and they were the ones that he did the most frightening experience of your life with. So that he could, and he was one of the people that showed that there was systematic variation in AAVE, like systematic use of the double pass, I'm trying to think of something now.
Third person verbs.
Been done that, third person verbs, all the features we now think of as AAVE. He was one of the first people that went out and said, look, we can see that this is happening systematically. It's not randomly, So, so the idea was that we did the same thing for interlanguage, right, for SLA. And we said, can we see if there is systematic variation in interlanguage based on these kinds of factors, right? So there's one, so phonological position is the fourth floor one, right? And so they did that one on 301. They looked at, sorry, that's not quite right. This is linguistic context, not social context. So they looked at how the liquid consonant R changed systematically for Japanese learning English, and found that there were differences depending upon what vowel was coming after the R. So in other words, the linguistic context, in this case, not the social context, said to them, this is how I'm going to pronounce this R based on what was coming next. For social context, yes. So we know what the theta is, right? The theta is the sound. So there was a study on the unvoiced theta. Where is that? Okay, so that's on page 304 and 5. Basically, in this case, he had Arabic speakers, and this guy Schmidt said that because the theta, the unvoiced theta, was a prestige form in the L1, the chances of the learner using it in the L2 in English was based on their education. So pronunciation of the sound and so voiced and unvoiced varied between university students and working class men, and his suggestion was that was because the more educated you were, the more likely you were to use the prestige theta, unvoiced theta in your first language, so the more likely are you to use it in your second language. Does that make sense? So the working class Arabic speakers, now I say this, I A, haven't read this study in years, and B, know nothing about Arabic. So let's be clear. If anybody knows more about Arabic, please tell us online. The idea is that they would be more familiar with the form because they use it more the more they're educated. Yeah. Okay. And then other social context factors are what we call situated context, which means who you're talking to, what you're talking about, and what the task is you're doing. So I've pulled out a few examples of this. Who you're talking to is 307. And in this case, it's Chinese and Thai. And basically what they say is if Chinese speakers are talking to an ethnic Thai speaker, they will change their production versus if they're talking to another Chinese speaker, systematically. Now, remember the important issue here is that this is systematic. It's fine, you know, it's not that they randomly do it. It's that they've done enough study to show that systematically this is going to happen, right? That's the important area about variationism, because there's also non-systematic variation that they talk about a little bit here that I haven't really covered, and that's sort of obviously non-systematic, right? But in the interlanguage, we're constantly trying to find systematic reasons why interlanguage is changing. Task is page 308. And in this case, it is about the difference, or actually it's the wrong way around. No, it is 309. If you see figure 11.5, it's the idea that your production of something will change depending upon the task. So this is mostly concerned with the formality of the task. So you are more likely to produce your closest, your most concentrated form, the form that is the least vernacular in something like a word list. So because you're trying harder, basically, the only thing you're focused on is pronunciation of the word list, right? But if you give someone a task that is more like free speech, so the vernacular, the one that Labov was interested in, you're more likely to get variance in forms or a different kind of form. Yeah. And then the last one on here is topic, and that's 313. And this is kind of an interesting one. The idea is that a given second language learner may try harder, essentially, if it's a topic that they really want to communicate in, right? So they might use different kinds of systematic communication strategies and ways of trying to explain what they mean that they just give up on in another environment. So the one that you've got here is Luis and a native speaker interviewer. And if you look at Luis is talking about a technical article. He's a some kind of contractor. And if you go to the bottom of the first paragraph that Luis is talking about, he says you have to adjust your equipment because the productivity of the equipment gets down because of the different height of the place. And the interviewer says, oh, I see, the altitude. And Luis says, yeah, the altitude, that is the word. That's the word I was looking for, altitude. The altitude makes a difference. So the idea is they're comparing that to the second example in which he, what is it Machaca? How do you say that, machaca?
That was good.
Oh, okay. And does that mean steak?
That's not a word I'm familiar with.
machaca?
It's dried beef.
It's dried beef. Oh, it's like beef jerky.
A little bit, except you mix it in with stuff like scrambled eggs or rice.
Oh, nice. Okay. So the idea is, in this case, he don't really care, like whether, so Louise says, no, you get some meat, you put the meat in the sun. Yep. And after that, I don't know what it is. I learned the name because I went to Farmer Jack. You make it little, oh my God, then you forget it. And he just laughs, right? Like he just gives up. And the idea is that systematically, if you look at learners in high stakes situations and in low stakes situations, they will change their communication strategies. Why is that interesting?
Why is what interesting?
That what I just said.
They change their strategies depending on how interested.
They change their strategies depending upon whether they perceive it as a low stakes or a high stakes interaction.
Steak.
Huh?
They're talking about steaks.
Oh, no, that wasn't what I meant, but that's good. Nice pun. Steaks and steaks, yeah. So I'm thinking about it in terms of learning, right? If you don't think it's a particularly, so you could send your kid abroad, right, on a study abroad program. But if your kid doesn't think it's particularly important to go around, talking Spanish or French or whatever it is, then they're not going to do it. Or even if they do it, they're not going to necessarily try very hard, right? So when I used to go every year to a bilingual school in Atlanta. Tell me if I've told you this story. And I had to give a talk to the parents at the beginning of every year. The headmaster, the principal, had me over to give this talk. And basically my talk was, your child is not going to be bilingual unless you are a Nazi, right? What do I mean by that? Well, they were French, not German, so that was good. What I meant by that was, if there's no high stakes involved, your kid is not going to do it. So your kid is growing up in America and you're trying to make it bilingual in French, okay? Which is what these parents were trying to do. And they were trying to do that by sending them on a Saturday to a French school, French immersion school, right? And then from this, they wanted their kids to basically become bilingual, right? I mean, obviously they were going to try and do other things too, watch movies or whatever, but what's the problem here? Well, the problem here is that the kid, if the kid knows that it can get anything it wants, if it really wants it, just by speaking English, it will know that and it won't bother speaking French, okay? In other words, if the situation is always low stakes, the chances are the child won't go for it. So the example I used was a guy who actually I didn't like very much, but he was a professor in history in the floor underneath our floor. He was bilingual French, and he would only talk to his children in French. From the moment they were born, he would only talk to them. If they wanted anything from him, if they wanted to watch a movie, if they wanted an ice cream, if they wanted a cuddle, if they wanted anything, they had to ask in French. Otherwise, it would not happen. And that's what I mean by being a Nazi, right? Because that's pretty tough, right? I don't know how many of you have raised kids or are raising kids out there. A lot of you, I think. But, you know, that's something that you have to really focus on if you're going to do that. And you have to be pretty brutal, right? To the point where this guy, this professor, his wife didn't speak French. But he would make them talk French at the dinner table, even though his wife couldn't understand what was going on. It's a very strange situation. But his children were, and then in summer he'd send them back to his family. His children were 100% bilingual, no question. For as long as he had control over them, they were, you know, because so the other parents at the school that he was running wanted their kids to be like his kids. So I had to try and explain in the nicest possible way that that's the only way you could get your kids to be like his kids. And did you really want to do that? So, any thoughts from our bilingual child?
Sounds really difficult.
Yeah.
I slip even when I'm trying to talk strictly Spanish.
Yeah. Right.
So
Right.
just doing that to a child is pretty.
Yeah. Now, it works best if you've got one parent who speaks one and one parent who speaks the other. But in combination, you've also got to be sending them back to, you know, Spain or France or whatever. And you've also, I mean, you don't have to be a total Nazi, I think, but you also do have to be absolutely, you know, because if they think they'll go through a stage when the most important person to them is their peers, and their peers are all speaking English, right? I'm assuming now an environment in which that's happening, not an environment where they might be in a school in California where most of their peers are maybe, in fact, speaking Spanish. So let's assume we're talking about a monolingual school somewhere in the US in English. At the point at which they only really want to talk to their peers, they don't want to talk to you anyway. They'll realize that they only need the English, and that's where they go. So in order to counteract that, there has to be some pretty heavy duty measures to counteract that. Because what happened with you, you just basically started speaking English, right?
Right.
And then.
I still speak Spanish.
Right.
You know, my parents, they're having to learn English to keep up.
Right.
To them, they're saying, oh, now to them it's crucial that they learn English.
Right. And I assume that your Spanish has gone through some language attrition.
More in vocabulary.
Yeah.
Where I learn all my new words in English, so if I don't translate them to Spanish, I don't learn them.
Yeah. Right. Right. So this is all. None of this is a mystery, right? This is all what we, you know. So to create a bilingual, a true bilingual in the way that this history guys were, he really, if you look at those three things, he was absolutely rigid. Every time they talked to him, they had to speak French. Every topic, every task, like if they needed to do something in order to be able to watch the movie, it had to be done, asked for questions, information gathering, all had to be in French. And whatever the topic was, all had to be in French. So that social context is super important if you're trying to do something like that. Okay, and the next thing they talk about is conversation analysis and communication strategies. I'm sort of going to blow over this a little bit because conversation analysis is basically an approach to discourse analysis, and we are doing discourse analysis next semester in the fall. I'm doing a whole class on discourse analysis, so it really fits better there than it does here. But why is it here, you ask yourself? Conversation analysis is a very specific kind of discourse analysis in which you literally are looking at the sequence of what is being said. You don't care who's saying it. So all this stuff means nothing. You don't care who it is, what they're doing, and what they're talking about. You literally are just looking at the sequence of the language as it is produced. Okay. Now, the best way to understand this is to look at the examples that they give you. So 318 to 319, probably the best example is table 11.13. The German, wie geht's es dir? How are you? Initial exchange is a routine adjacency pair. Es geht good. I'm okay. The NS questions response by saying warum, why. Basically, literally all you're doing is explaining everything that's going on one by one by one by one. Why, you may ask yourself, would you want to do that? What do you learn by doing that, do you think?
If there's a pattern.
Exactly. That's exactly what conversation analysis does. Conversation analysis says there is a pattern for interaction. There's a pattern that none of us talk about. It's never discussed, but it is there. Okay. And conversation analyst's job is to analyze that pattern. Okay. So let me give you a for instance. My discourse analysis is my field. I do something called interactional sociolinguistics. I'm super interested in who's talking to whom about what, particularly in an intercultural or cross-cultural environment, right? So I want to know if you're the teacher and you're the student, or if you're the doctor and you're the patient, and I'm interested in power differential, right? CA is interested in the pattern that is created. So it's not interested in whether you're the doctor or you're the patient or you're the teacher or you're the student. What it's interested in is how the architecture of sequentiality works in language, right? Right, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. Yes, so if you want any more information about that, we have a visitor coming in the fall, Joan Kelly Hall, who was chair at Penn State University and was chair of AAAL. And she is coming to visit us in the fall, and she is a CA socioculturalist. So everything that we've done today, she's going to talk about. And she knows so much more about it than I do. That will all wait till we see the video in fall. And I will publicize that so you guys can come. If you can come, it's going to be awesome. And the other thing is this idea of communication strategies, which are adjustments to this ongoing design, right? So when you look at SLA, you're looking at what patterns are created that are different in this sequentiality that you're expecting, right? Because now you've got this issue that you have an expert at the language and a novice at the language. So how does that change the sequence of conversation that you would normally expect? Okay. So it changes it, and your book gives you various examples of how it changes it. Like the novice, so the language learner, might use a variety of things that you would never see inside a monolingual conversation, such as a language switch, where you code switch from one thing to another, okay? Or a literal translation, where they're actually taking something metaphoric, but they just give a literal translation, right? Think of something like kick the bucket, okay? So they might literally think that means to kick the bucket, right? language avoidance, some kind of approximation. So these things change the typical sequence. And wasn't it here last week I was talking about vertical versus horizontal? No, that wasn't here. I did. Thank you very much. Huh?
Model by browsing.
Yes. So it's this idea that for native speakers, our conversation sort of goes in a, well, it doesn't matter whether you do it like that or do it like that, but it keeps moving forward, right? But with when a non-native speaker is involved, yeah, you go forward a little bit, then there's a problem. So then you go around, then you go forward, then you go around. Then you might go around 7 more. So it's a different kind of interaction. So what CA people do is use CA techniques, which is looking line by line to see exactly how that forward, stop, round, forward, stop, round, 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 stop, forward, you know, works. And how that's different from native speaker interaction.
Sounds exhausting.
CA is so detail oriented, Diego, that you have to be a certain kind of person to want to do it. I don't know if you looked at the transcripts, but you guys might want to look at the transcript on page 318. Do you see all those little symbols and stuff? The little circles and the little dots and the little R's and the little, everything is meaningful.
Intonation.
Yes, some of it is intonation, some of it is pausing, some of it is lengthening. Literally, yeah, like the question marks, that's rising intonation. The single period is falling intonation. The long lines are, the brackets are overlap. One person's overlapping another person. Oh God, it is, I mean, it takes forever to do a conversation analysis transcript, but it has to be said, some people love it. Julie Bouchard, who I don't think any of you know now, was one of my PhD students. She did an entire dissertation in CA and absolutely loved it. It would have driven me completely around the bend. But what she did was look at SLA and CA and code switching. She went into a French classroom, a classroom in Canada. She was teaching, and she looked at what points in the interaction these kids who were only supposed to be speaking English, in the Francophone kids who were only supposed to be speaking English, at what point in the interaction they changed their mind and put in some French, and why that might be. And then she compared that to regular bilinguals. So it was an awesome project, but it, you know, yeah, you have to be the person that wants to be a CA transcriptionist, yeah, which would not be me. All right, we've got a couple more things to go. The first one is what's called interlanguage pragmatics. So this has, and again, those of you who've done pragmatics have done this already. Those of you who have not done pragmatics yet, you're about to do this. But to give you an idea of what this is, let's go to page 331. I'm going to do this for Sheepman. 331, and everybody at home, go ahead also to 331 and take a look at exercise 2. You have a task. So basically you have a situation, and then you have to decide based on the responses to the situation whether A, B, C, D, and so on are native speakers or non-native speakers, and why. Okay? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this. Do you understand what you're doing?
Maybe.
So you're reading the situation, and then you're looking at the responses. And the idea is, based on the responses to that particular situation, you have to decide if you think you're looking at a native speaker of English or a non-native speaker of English.
And each one of these lettered sentences is written by the same person? Or
No. Some of them are by native speakers, some of them are by non-native speakers. You have to decide which and why you think something's written by a native speaker or a non-native speaker.
Okay.
All right. So, did you get the general idea? Okay. So we're not going to necessarily go through all of them, but give me one where you said this is definitely a native speaker.
Definitely a native?
Yeah. D. I would like to take this opportunity to apologize for missing the scheduled meeting. I agree. I think that's definitely a native speaker. Give me one that you think is almost definitely not a native speaker.
F.
F. Last Thursday, I missed your interview by accident. Yes. Why do you think that's not a native speaker?
It's understood that the interviewer is giving you an opportunity,
Right.
not the other way around.
Right. Good.
It makes
Good.
it sound like he forgot or something.
Yes. Right. Hey,
I was busy.
bummer.
Yeah.
Give me another one that you think is definitely not a native speaker.
N.
N.
Yes.
I'm very interested in your company. Working at the ABC Corporation is my dream. I cannot give up my dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. And why, Mark, would you say that?
Oh, it reminds me of that Saturday Night Live skit where they go into like a miserable. Cannot give up my dream.
Right. It's too much, right?
Yeah,
It's
way
too much.
dramatic and
Yeah.
emotional.
Yeah. Good. How about what was the one we did? Oh yeah. L.
Definitely not native.
Definitely non-native. And why definitely non-native, Diego?
Or Morrissey.
Or Morrissey. Yes. Oh, all the young people won't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's all right.
Sorry, Diego.
The appropriate speech. It's not something that.
Yeah, it's wrong, right? This is not an appropriate, yeah.
Not formal.
It's not formal enough, it's not appropriate. Okay, what you just did is called interlanguage pragmatics. And it bases itself largely on speech act analysis. And a speech act is something like this. So it's an apology, it's a refusal, it's a compliment, it's a request. All these things are called speech acts. And the way that we realize speech acts in a language is hugely culturally driven. All right, our expectations of what you're supposed to say at a given point are hugely cultural driven. So in most cases here, we could specify like, you know, this wasn't too informal, this was too dramatic, you know, but either way, even if you can't specify it, as someone within a given speech community, you can usually tell that something's off, right? This isn't the way that you would do it. So if you go back and look at page 323, this is how we do speech act analysis, okay? If you look at the bottom on page 322, this is called a DCT, or a discourse completion test. And again, those of you that haven't done pragmatics, when you do it, you will be all over this. So a DCT basically is trying to get to the heart of what is acceptable in one culture versus another. So you have to complete this task. You promise to return a textbook to your classmate within a day or two after Xeroxing a chapter. You held on to it for almost 2 weeks. Classmate, I'm really upset about the book because I needed to prepare for last week's class. A DCT would then have a line, a gap, saying, how would you respond? Okay. So, Mark, if this happened to you, I said, I'm really upset about the book because I needed it to prepare for last week's class. What would you say?
I'm really sorry that I forgot.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that I forgot. I suck as a human being.
Right.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, right. Right, good. Here's the response that they give you. I have nothing to say. Okay. This was from a non-native speaker who completed this DCT. And you can see what they say. It's clear that this response sounds rude to a native speaker of English and suggests a lack of willingness to apologize. However, what the non-native speaker actually meant was, I have no excuse for this.
That's what I thought.
Say that again?
Yeah, that response totally works in my country. I have nothing to say.
Oh, so the direct translation would be, I have nothing to say.
Mhm.
Oh, so this maybe was a Korean. Oh, that's great. Thanks, Sheehan. You're awesome to have when we're doing a sociocultural theory. Yeah, so, and of course, we perceive it as meaning, yeah. Okay, it really isn't that important. I don't care what you think, kind of thing, which is, of course, completely wrong. Not what. Okay, so interlanguage pragmatics deals with both things. First, it deals with the fact that apologies and things are done differently in different cultures and at different times and for different reasons. And it also deals with, when it comes to interlanguage pragmatics, the kinds of mistakes that learners make when it comes to pragmatics, okay? So to give you one example, there was quite a lot of studies on Hebrew, and it turns out that there was a big study in the 90s in Israel. Basically, if you were late for a business meeting, you didn't apologize. You didn't go up afterwards to your boss and apologized, okay? But if you were late to a business meeting in America, you did go up to your boss afterwards and apologize. Okay, so it's not just the language, but also the apology itself. And the reason that happened was because apparently for the speakers in Israel, they assume that their boss knows that they're sorry. Because of course they wouldn't have been late if they possibly couldn't have been. Right? So it doesn't make any sense to go and apologize for something that, of course, your boss already knows that you're sorry for. Okay? But if you did this in America, you would expect, right, an apology. So that's called sociopragmatics. And then the other part, this is pragmalinguistics, which is, if you say it, are you saying the right thing? So this, I have nothing to say, is a classic pragmalinguistic problem, meaning the form is wrong, okay? They've got the sociopragmatics. They know they're supposed to say something. And in fact, what they were trying to say is, I have no excuse. So they know they're supposed to apologize. But the form is so wrong that it no longer sounds like an apology. So those are the two issues that interlanguage pragmatics deals with. And it's kind of a fun gig. And some of the things that people are looking at when it comes to interlanguage pragmatics are things like universals. What's universal about pragmatics? In other words, what goes across languages? Okay, what can we rely on? So can you think of what might be universal and what might not be universal?
Well, something that's not universal is raising your voice at the end of a question.
Okay, good, but that's not really pragmatics,
Oh, okay.
right? Let's stay with pragmatics. Let's stay with speech acts.
Greetings and leave takings are universal.
Good. So greetings, and the fact that we have greetings and leave taking is universal, right? The fact that we say something different means that it's not universal, right? So the speech acts itself, and this is often what happens, the speech acts themselves are universal. You apologize in every language, you compliment in every language, you refuse in every language, but how you do that, what language you use to do that, and what strategies you use to do that can be very different, okay? Like in English, when we apologize, we usually have a 3-part apology, which is I'm sorry, so some basic I'm sorry, then a reason why, and then a basically this will never happen again kind of comment. And that's the full typical for a North American apology. So, oh God, I'm really sorry. I totally forgot, then I realized yesterday, and that's why I brought it today. And, you know, I never normally like this. It would never happen again. I don't normally hold on to people's stuff. That would be a full-blown American apology, right? But that's not the same in all languages. In fact, as Shihoon rather helpfully said, in Korean, you could just say, I have nothing to say. Right. Meaning, I suck so badly. I know this. I got nothing. Yeah. Right. So that's universals. Acquisition is how do you acquire pragmatics, right? Like, how do you learn what you apologize for in another language, how you do it, etc., etc. Like, does it have to be instructed in a classroom? Is it going to be good if you instruct it in a classroom using something like DCTs? What are the problems if you do it in a classroom? What kinds of things might you think of that would, if you're trying to teach pragmatics in an instructed classroom?
You'd have to provide lots of examples.
Good. First thing is you have to provide lots of examples. Why? Because everything changes depending upon who you're talking to, right? So if you're talking to your best friend versus talking to your teacher and you're giving them a compliment, right? There's 2 completely different ways of doing that, right? Depending. So you have to have a gazillion examples. What else do you think might be problematic?
Medium.
Okay, tell me more.
So if it's written or in person, there's differences there.
Okay, good. Yes. The other thing you've got to do is have a gazillion examples that cross medium boundaries, right? Because what you write versus what you say. So, for example, one of the examples we had in the back when you started this exercise, please, please, please give me another chance, right? That might even be remotely possible if you were talking to the person face to face, but certainly is not even remotely possible in a written apology, right? Good. Anything else?
Also, what the goals of the learners are, because, for example, if you're teaching teenagers who are native Spanish speakers English, your instruction in pragmatics is going to be very different if they're, for example, in Los Angeles or somewhere else in the United States, and their reason for learning English is just to function socially in general in
Mm-hmm.
the country where they live, as opposed to if they were in Mexico and their entire reason for learning English is to get a job in the hospitality industry,
Right.
or a hotel or something.
Right.
So
Good. So space for pragmatics in the curriculum is often really problematic. Like, how much space do you make for pragmatics as opposed to syntax, for example? And then how far do you get into it? Like, how much is it likely that they can make a mess of it? What is it you don't want them to make a mess of? So interlanguage pragmatics is often talked about in a similar sort of way as taboo topics, right? So you have to try and teach them enough that they're not dangerous. But the problem is with something like pragmatics, you have to know a lot before you're not dangerous, right? So you have to know the ins and outs of everything, because with pragmatics, people assume intent from the language. So if you look at that example, I'm really upset, I have nothing to say. The native speaker of American English assumes intent. Okay, the native speaker of American English doesn't say, oh, I wonder if that's what they say in Korean, because that sounds really bad here, but maybe they say that in Korean. Instead, what the native speaker says is, damn, you know, that person's really rude. Like, you know, that's the last time I let that guy, you know, I helped that guy, right? Because when it comes to pragmatics, we always assume intent. Syntax, morphology, basic issues in phonology, segmental issues, we're quite happy to say, oh, they're a non-native speaker. But when it comes to issues like pragmatics, we almost always assume intent first and have to be told later that they didn't mean it that way. So that's a huge fun topic, and we will do a lot more of that in pragmatics.